Hello, interwebs, and unfortunately, yet again, I have to talk about JK Rowling. Yeah, I spent pretty much most of my yesterday morning and a lot of my day talking about Gina Carano and all the, stuff going on with her on Twitter and everything like that in my last video. And I thought, heavens me, that was going to be the main transgender issue that I was going to have to talk about this week and the main transgender topic that I was going to have to discuss. And I'm like, oh, finally, I can relax a little bit, don't have to talk about anything else. And then we learn about JK Rowling's latest thing in her descent into transgender villain. JK Rowling's doing some stuff. So for those of you who haven't heard the news, JK Rowling on Tuesday published yet another book in her Coromum Strike series, which is sort of like I haven't read it, it's sort of like a detective noir series that she writes under a pseudonym named Robert Galarath or something like that, which I have also heard. I don't know the specifics on this, but I also heard the pseudonym that she uses is tangentially tied to some anti-LGBTQ person who also had the same name in history. Could just be a coincidence, but knowing J.K. Rowling's penchant for looking up names, that's an interesting tidbit that I haven't had a lot of time to look into, I'll be honest. But anyways, the latest book in this series, Troubled Blood, was released this week under that pseudonym that J.K. Rowling uses, and apparently the meat of the story revolves around this idea of a serial killer going around who is a cisgender man, i.e. non-transgender man, dressing up as a woman to go and kill either multiple people or at least a singular person. But again, this sort of trope of a man pretending to be a woman in order to hurt others, in order to basically kill other people. Which, in the light of everything else that J.K. Rowling has said about the trans community lately, frames that whole storyline in a very particular light. So to be very honest with you, when I heard that this book was being released and I heard what it was about, I, quite honestly, with all of you, wasn't all that surprised. I was surprised that it was kind of coming out so quickly after the fact that she sort of came out about her transgender views and views on trans people. So it's clearly something that she has been working on for a decent chunk of time and was working on or finishing up when she sort of came out a few months ago about her views on trans people, sort of came public about them. And I'm not going to go into a full explanation here of what J.K. Rowling's views on trans people are and why I think they're harmful to the trans community, nor am I going to delve into the huge specifics of what TERFs are, which is a group that if J.K. Rowling does not expressly believe herself to be a part of, she definitely shares a lot of views with them, and a lot of people in the TERF community do support her and sort of look up to her because of her views on trans people. But if you are curious about all of that stuff, I did do 2 videos on it that I'll link down in the down below, and then I'll probably link at least one of them, probably the one on TERFs as a whole up here, and then I did a longer one that sort of gets into J.K. Rowling more specifically as well. But just to talk about TERFs briefly, the views of TERFs and what J.K. Rowling herself expressed in her essay on trans people was this basic idea that transgender people, trans women specifically, don't really exist, but what they are and what we are supposedly are just men who are pretending to be women, and that act of men pretending to be women just philosophically harms women, but also can more directly harm women in terms of we invade their spaces, or the more insidious thing that a lot of TERFs just say expressly and believe, that all trans people, all trans women are rapists, that they want to use the fact that they are women to have sex with women or get near women, invade women's spaces like in bathrooms like that in order to assault or attack women sexually. And again, it's a whole larger topic to discuss, and I don't want to oversimplify it. Like I said, I've done larger videos on it. But the thing that frustrates me with this situation with J.K. Rowling is there's honestly quite a few things. If you watch my other videos on J.K. Rowling and on this topic, and really on any of my discussions on people who have been accused of transphobia or are sharing views that I believe are even harmful to the trans community, what I try to do as someone discussing these things is always assume best possible intent. Always try to assume that the person on the other side of the argument, like J.K. Rowling, or most recently in my last video, Gina Carano, but I also did one on William Shatner as well, and a few other people, I always try to assume what's the best possible way that I can look at them and sort of see where they're coming from. This is not to say that I don't say that what I think they're doing is not harmful to the trans community. I have talked again a bunch about why I think JK Rowling's views are harmful to the trans community, but I also try to pair that with the fact that J.K. Rowling herself may not view what she is saying and what she is doing as expressly harmful to the trans community. I think she even says in her essay that she understands that trans people can also be assaulted, that she understands that trans people, go through a lot, that she understands that trans people are a group of people that exist. And so I don't necessarily, she's like sitting there in her home thinking like, yeah, screw trans people, I hate them, at least not as a whole group. So I always try to come at it with that kernel and that sort of assumption in mind that the person on the other side of this argument, while they may be harmful to the trans community, intentionally or not, that they themselves may not view themselves as a transphobic person. And I tend to think that we should look at transphobia as an action that someone can be, not something that someone is necessarily. Now, if you pile on a lot of transphobia over and over and over again, we can kind of say you're a transphobic person. But generally, we should think of transphobia as more as an action, something, a way to describe something that someone does, rather than something that someone is. Kind of like racism to a degree. Yes, there are racist people, but a lot of the time there are people who are not, who we especially call racists, but do racist actions. Just to sort of like show an equivalency of what I'm trying to discuss here. So that's what I try to assume when I look at JK Rowling. But then I look at this book and what she is trying to say with this book. And clearly this book is just an expression of that ideology of what TERFs believe. It's quite literally a man pretending to be a woman in order to harm others, in order to harm probably women, and doing it in a way that is expressly villainous. It's expressly over the top and gross and disgusting. Like, I am someone who believes, like, if someone does this, I'm not, like, saying, like, oh, if a man attacks and pretends to be a woman and attacks other people, that we should totally understand them as trans. Like, no, I don't believe that at all. If someone attacks other people, they should be harmed for them, regardless of their gender identity or how they presented, whatever the case. Being trans is in many ways irrelevant to when someone is assaulted. And I also don't believe that there is many even examples of trans people or people pretending to be trans or trans people assaulting women. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but it's way less of a deal than JK Rowling and many TERFs would have you to believe. And I also wish to be clear too that even if it did happen more often than what TERFs are saying, and again, it does not happen as often as TERFs are saying, but even if it did, the very fact that somebody was assaulted who pretended to be trans does not delegitimize all trans identities, nor does it mean that we should outlaw being trans or, legislate trans lives. Assault, no matter what, is still illegal. And it will always be illegal whether we support trans people or not, and it doesn't mean that people who assault others cannot be persecuted whether they are trans or not. So to say, like, we should take rights away from trans people or not acknowledge trans people or whatever because someone pretended to be trans is ridiculous and completely misunderstands how laws should work. Like, to use a completely separate example, we don't outlaw everyone using cars just because someone ran into somebody with a car. You make the action of driving into somebody with a car illegal. You don't outlaw all cars. So this book is perpetuating this narrative, is perpetuating this idea that these kind of things exist and that they are a problem. And it's tying into this narrative. And yes, there's an element of, like, she can kind of distance herself from the fact that it's like, well, I'm not saying all trans people like this, but clearly it's a thing. This is just one character in this novel that I'm doing. But it just seeps this trope, this idea, this harmful idea to the trans community into public consciousness further. She's using her platform to tie these ideas together. And yes, you can kind of put in the veneers like, I'm not talking about trans people, it's just a guy who's doing some things, but that's what you're saying that trans people are. Men pretending to be women to hurt others, whether they intend to or not. And you're doing it in such an overt way, in a way that vilifies this person. Again, I'm not saying the acts of this character in this novel are in any way justifiable, but you're sort of making the connection. Especially when you have been so recently talking about this issue, the connection gets made quite obviously between all of us. Like, we're going to clearly make that connection whether you intended to or not. And clearly, I feel like the fact that she's come out about this recently, it's clear that there's a reason that she wanted these two things to be tied together. It's just frustrating. And it's just sad, and it keeps me from thinking like, oh, she can have a good intent here, because it's just vilifying and continuing to harp on this point in a way that even seeps into your fiction. Like, I can look at like Harry Potter and other things that she's written and be like, yeah, I can read some problematic stuff in here. Like, I can read some problematic issues into how house elves are treated in Harry Potter, and how that sort of maps sort of kind of weirdly onto slavery, and the idea that like house elves like being enslaved is kind of strange, even though you're using them as like a slavery allegory. It's one of those, like, I can separate that a little bit. Like, I do have problems with it and think it's a heavily problematic issue within the Harry Potter series, but I can kind of separate that out. But here it's just so intrinsically linked to what you've been discussing in your politics in recent weeks, months, years. So I just can't separate it, and it's just clearly coming across as an overt attack on the trans community. Whether that's how you want it to be portrayed or not, that's how it is really coming across, because you're actively vilifying us. You're making us the villains of your story, whether you can put the veneer on of this isn't a trans person or not. And as I've said, the stuff that I've done a whole video on it. Like I said, I don't want to get into the nitty gritty of it, but like a lot of the things that JK Rowling claim are either wrong, flat out wrong, misleading, or intentionally not really fully researched. I've done, like I said, I've done a whole video on it, but whether she, intentionally misled people or not, she does not share all the facts correctly. And does not frame them correctly. And again, I've done a whole video discussing it. So you're just continuing this misleading narrative and actively vilifying people that you yourself have even acknowledged are marginalized. It's just, it honestly boggles my mind, and it deeply, deeply frustrates me. Because again, I am someone who tries my best to assume best possible intent. And there's only so much empathy that I can continue to give to, like, I can empathize with you being someone who was the victim of an assault. I can empathize with you being someone who was harassed on Twitter for these views. Again, I do believe that her views are harmful, but that does not mean that she should be harassed or attacked or given death threats or anything like that. I don't condone that at all. And I think that's not necessary and way over the top. She does get my empathy, and she does, and I always try to assume best possible intent, but that can only extend so far. And releasing a book like this, especially when it's like clear that you're intending that this book to link to your views on trans people because of when you released the book and when you started talking about trans people more openly and publicly, there's an end to that empathy here. And like I said, I always try to assume best possible intent. Well, there's only so much good intent that I can assume with this continually over and over and over again cropping up. And the other thing, too, that really frustrates me about this whole situation that I forgot to mention when I was doing my initial recording is that this whole book, this whole idea for this book of the man pretending to be a woman and turns out to be a villain psycho killer is even removing itself from the trans discussion. It's just an overdone and overrated trope that is like, why would you even bother writing a book about this? It's like, we've seen this a billion times before, and it's an overdone and offensive trope, not even dealing with trans people, but just queer coding. Like, queer coding villains has been a thing for a really long time, where it's you have a villain and you code them as queer. You either make them expressly like LGBT, gay, lesbian, bisexual, or transgender, or any member of the queer community, and then also making them a villain, and then thereby intrinsically linking the two, saying that being queer is intrinsically linked with being villainous. So being gay is intrinsically linked with being villainous. Being trans is intrinsically linked with villainous. And we've seen this for ages, for such a long time. I mean, I've done whole videos about the queer coding of Disney villains, but even before Disney villains, the queer coding of villains in throughout all of cinema history, going back to like the Hays Code. It's existed in books before. We saw it with trans people over and over and over again in movies like Silence of the Lambs with Buffalo Bill. It's linking the two without any sort of awareness or acknowledgement of like the fact that Buffalo Bill was a villain was not that Buffalo Bill was dealing with gender issues, but because Buffalo Bill kept a person in a hole and killed them. It has nothing to do with being trans. It has everything to do with the fact that he's just a horrible human being, or she's a horrible human being. I don't know Buffalo Bill's pronouns. It's just conflating two completely irrelevant things, and was done back in a time where that was the intention. The intention was, by the Hays Code, to show that being queer, being part of the LGBTQ community, was a villainous thing, and something that unfortunately just got stuck around in cinematic language even after the Hays Code went away. But the intention was, from when it began, to villainize the queer community. And I've done videos on that, so please check out, like I said, that Disney video. I'll link it down in the down below, and I'll also put it up in the above. So that's the history of this trope. And so JK Rowling leaning into it is honestly just, number one, lazy, because it's a trope that's been done before, but even worse, leaning into a trope that's express intention from its inception, whether it's intended from the beginning or not, was to villainize the queer community. And so the very fact that she is leaning into a trope whose history is intended to villainize the queer community, and that she has so expressly sort of linked her ideals of trans people with, men pretending to be women, it's creating this subtle link through everything she said and in her work of, hey, look, this is something that is a problem with trans people, and then connecting that to her fiction and saying like, hey, look, this is someone who's kind of similar to that, and then connecting it to a trope that villainized these people, that villainizes trans people, that villainizes the queer community. And so you create this causal link that goes through and says, hey, trans people are a problem, trans people are villainous, trans people are trying to hurt you. It's honestly just kind of gross and disgusting. And again, I tried to give her the benefit of the doubt in all cases, so maybe this isn't her intention, but she's clearly not a bad writer. She clearly knows how to use tropes and subvert them, so it boggles my mind that she would not be aware of these things. So it honestly just makes it harder for me to try and give her the benefit of the doubt, because she's not a bad writer. She's not a horrible writer, so she's leaning into a trope, and so it's just makes it lazy. So even if we remove the trans aspect of this whole discussion, even if we talk about it separate from trans issues, it's just, a rote trope that she is clearly more inventive than. She's clearly a better writer than to just use overrated and offensive tropes that have been used for decades before now. Anyways, I just wanted to make sure I said that, and I forgot to mention it before I, finished filming. So, I kind of want to end on that note. It's just, I'm honestly just frustrated and angered by this, and that's coming from someone who tries my best not to get angry and not to get frustrated at situations like this. That's someone that's trying to feel as open about it as possible and try and be as positive about it as I possibly can. There's only so far that can go. I guess I had more to say on this than I thought, because I actually thought that I was just going to be like, yeah, well, I'm not surprised. But it's just frustrating. One last note that I will end on is I think there is a little bit more to discuss on this topic, and I actually discussed a lot of it with a fellow YouTuber, Council of Geeks. We record a podcast together, What the Frel. Might as well hawk my wares. If you're a Farscape fan, we rewatch Farscape on this What the Frel podcast. But before we recorded our latest episode, we talked about JK Rowling, and I believe Council of Geeks is going to be publishing a video on JK Rowling, if not... If it's not already out, it will be out relatively soon, so I will link that in the down below, and I don't want to steal their talking points, because we did talk about it, and I know that they're planning to do a video on it, so I don't want to steal their talking points, and so I will recommend that you go and watch the video. I haven't seen it, but I do know what they're going to be talking about in that video, so I would highly recommend that you check it out, because I think it will go further into a little bit more of the history and a little bit of our own, as a Harry Potter fandom, a little bit of our own culpability to a degree in it, in a way that I found surprising, but I totally acknowledge is really interesting and true. So I will recommend that you check that video out. If it's not already out, if it is out, I will link it up here. If it's not already out, I will eventually link it down in the down below, and I'll also share it in my community tab on my channel once it does go live. So I highly recommend you check out that video. Other than that, that's really all I have to say. There's nothing really new here in terms of, ideology to break down, which is sort of my bread and butter. There's nothing new ideologically. It's just sort of frustrating because it's like there's only so much empathy I can give you, JK. And that's coming from someone who tries my best to be someone who gives empathy, while not necessarily giving ground on where harm is done, but trying to be empathetic. So yeah, I guess that's all I have to say. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more discussions of transphobia, but also like some fun geeky pop culture stuff and LGBTQ issues and social and political issues in pop culture. All that stuff's right here on this channel. I also, like I said, do a podcast, What the Frel. I do another podcast called Behind the Reactor with Lil Reloaded, where we discuss news and views and all that fun stuff. I also have a Patreon if you want to help me out over there. Helps me stay motivated to do these things and talk about this stuff. So, and helps me get to do more stuff and get yourself cool perks. So, yeah, beyond all of that, I just hope that you, as always, live long and prosper. Thank you so much to all of my patrons, especially Ashley Allen Bokikio, Miranda Janelle, Eli Berg-Moss, Ashlyn Solstice, Christina Dalliance, Greg Gillum, Stephen Clinard, Munir Amlani, Boyd and Mary Beth Earl, Wayne Twitchell, Ish the Mad, Buttoneer, Randy Thompson, Jemshin, Lorena Mesa, Mari Neckar, Wellington Marcus, John Steele, Michael Beam, William Stewart, Gavin Robinson, Jason Knott, Maeve, Subraxis, Tonya Trummer, Wen Dizzle-Bizzle, Gretchen Badger, Dante St. James, Polly Mina, Piston Twisted Garage, and Bree Beecher. Thank you all so much for your continued support.